Good morning, everyone. I am NOW's National President, Christian Nunes, and I am so thrilled this morning to welcome you all to our 2022 Racial Justice Summit. Our theme this year is Connected by Justice and Intersectionality, Facing the Realities of Race in America. And this theme is so critical and so important this year. So we're excited to welcome you all in virtual reality and our virtual lives and space. Thank you to our West Coasters and Pacificers for joining us early this morning. But we have some important information, some fabulous panelists and experts to share with you this day. So I'm glad you have your coffee and your pajamas, and for those early workers that you're here with us. And for our East Coasters and Midwesterners, thank you for joining us as well in your early morning as well. So while we have some accountability, we've seen some accountability and attitudes toward race in the recent years, we still know the incidents of racial injustice are still too prevalent here in the American landscape to ignore. So today we have to hold important conversations to help us seek intersectional solutions that create meaningful change toward racial justice for all women. Our three panels today, we are really touching on the importance of these core facets, with what it really means to fully recognize what it looks like for participants in our society regarding racial justice, reproductive justice and freedom, racial justice in the housing crisis, and racial justice in voting rights. All three of these core issues in these three areas are deeply impacted by systematic racism and discrimination. And each area are intrinsically connected in so many other areas in the lives of how we are faced today and how we live our lives. Without the freedom to control our own bodies, without the ability to find safe and equitable housing for our families, without the ability to participate fully in our democracy, we cannot say that we have justice, and we cannot say that we have full democracy or we have autonomy. And we cannot really truly say that Black, Indigenous, people of color will ever be able to achieve true equality if we do not have these things. So NOW is committed to ensuring that historically excluded communities of color have the freedom to safely participate at every level. And today's event will help us stay informed and keep our activism informed and hold us accountable in our activism in the areas for years to come. So we are excited to be today to hear from major experts to tell us what we need to do to be accountable and stay informed. Ending racism is one of NOW's core issues, and we are committed to identifying and combating the barriers to equality and justice imposed by structural racism, particularly to those inflicted at a double burden of race and sex discrimination on BIPOC women and girls, including trans women and girls. And we must build a genuinely intersectional future where our policy leaders are working to address these issues of gender and racial inequalities that we certainly know are not new, but have been left out for so long and exacerbated for the 2 years during COVID. So we know that COVID has had a major impact on the women and girls for these two areas. But most importantly, we need to recognize that in order to be genuine in this work that we're doing, we must do our own work and our own reconciliation in our own homes, right? And we have to understand that we cannot be authentic in our own advocacy if we fail to do our own restorative justice in the systematic racism that's occurring. So we have to do our own work before we can be effective allies and help do reconciliation to help in racial justice. So last month, when we grieved the 1-year anniversary of a racist and violent attack of our nation's capital, the terrifying images of the Confederate flags being paraded through the halls of Congress as violent and racist insurrectionists tried to destroy our democracy were visual symbols of the deeply embedded racism that BIPOC individuals face every single day through microaggressions and macroaggressions. And BIPOC communities have to face this every single day. While much of the systematic racism we face is subtle, it is no less deadly in its ability to rob us of our fundamental rights. And that is why we are, as an organization and as individual activists, we must never stop our efforts to fully move forward in our mission for racial justice. It is our duty and it is our commitment. And then now we have taken a holistic approach to women's rights, and our advocacy is always conducted through an intersectional lens. In addition to this event summit today, we engage in extensive racial equity training for our body, for our board, for our staff and members, and advocates strongly to make a look at our policies to advance racial justice. So this is our commitment that we've made to this organization. For now, intersectional feminism means that every piece of legislation, policy, or program that we support must address marginalized and under-resourced populations, including our program that we support, must address it, BIPOC, LGBTQIA+ communities. It is at our core, and we must continue to do this work. And so as we continue to engage today, we hope that we enlighten you, that we learn, and we are all learning together, and we hope that you find excitement in these sessions. So our first panel that we're going to talk about today is the housing crisis and the impact that the housing crisis has on women and families. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that people are running out of affordable places to live. However, the lack of action by both the Trump and administrations and by the administration we're feeling right now, the housing administration continues to escalate disproportionately to BIPOC communities and props up how we're seeing structural racism still impacts the communities. And in many cases, skin color predetermines a person's eligibility for affordable housing and to seek affordable resources and financial assistance. Minority groups, particularly we know Black groups, Black and Brown individuals, Latinx, are the ones proportionally experiencing more homelessness. And majority of these communities are families and children. And we don't see that face when we see it on the news or we see it in ads. So we want to bring attention to this today. And those who experience the stress of housing discrimination, displacement, or homelessness endure related issues, including increase in violence against women, food insecurity, lack of healthcare accessibility, transportation, and much more. We know that housing is a basic human right. And as a basic human right, no American should have to be denied housing because of their race, their ethnicity, their sex, gender, or socioeconomic status. So today's panel will discuss the depths of the housing crisis and how we plan to address this interconnected issue that's accompanying the growing issue that we're seeing to face. But first, we want to bring a big welcome to our featured keynote speaker, U.S. Congressman Jamie Raskin, who represents Maryland's 8th Congressional District and the U.S. House of Representatives. Congressmember Raskin serves on the House's Judiciary Committee and the Committee of Oversight and Reform. Among others, he was also renamed the chair of the Oversight Subcommittee of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties for the 717th Congress. Prior to his time in Congress, Congressman Raskin was a 3-term state senator in Maryland, where he also served as a Senate Majority Whip. He earned a reputation for building coalitions to deliver a series of landmark legislation accomplishments. He was also a professor of constitutional law at American University for Washington College of Law for over 25 years. And he is an accomplished author of over several books, including the best-selling book, Overhauling Democracy, the Supreme Court versus the American People. So it is my great honor to help me welcome Congressman Raskin.
Hi, it's Jamie Raskin calling out to all my friends at the National Organization for Women's Racial Justice Summit. Congratulations on putting this together. It's so important. I wish we could be together, but I thought I would just take a moment or two to focus on the central importance of housing as a human right and a civil right in America. We've been working to close the income gap. We've been working to expand affordable housing. We're obviously coming out of a wretched period under the Trump administration where the housing crisis began to spin out of control. And this obviously had terrible effects in minority communities. I've been excited about the housing provisions of the Build Back Better Act, including the $10 billion investment to support first-time, first-generation home buyers. We know that home ownership is a central key to building intergenerational wealth. And we're hoping this program will help to close the persistent racial wealth gap in my region, but also across the country. The Build Back Better Act's housing components will bolster other parts of the working families agenda and therefore advance generally the situation of working families. We're working on providing universal pre-K for all 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. We want to expand access to affordable higher education. We want to extend the expanded child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and of course the child care provisions as well. So in Build Back Better, we are really trying to focus on housing and on the other goods that people need in order to lift them up out of poverty, and that will have a tremendously beneficial effect for people across the country, and especially those caught in poverty in the African American community, the Latino community, and other minority communities. So thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for foregrounding this problem. And I look forward to working with you on getting those provisions in Build Back Better passed. We know we've run into some political problems, but the overriding historical imperative is to get this done. So thank you for what you're doing at NOW. Thank you for having the Racial Justice Summit, and I look forward to working with you on making sure that we get this agenda done.
Thank you so much, Congressman Raskin, for your dedicated work on this issue and your thought-provoking words. We look forward to working with you as well, and along with coalition partners for making sure that housing is an inclusive issue and that we are representing our communities as well. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for our housing crisis panel, Shauna Tarboro, who is an amazing housing advocate. She is an advanced deputy director for the Arizona Fair Housing Center and for the Southwest Fair Housing Council. Previously, she serves as a holistic development coach for the Alliance Center for Spiritual Growth, a nonprofit aimed at health and wellness for persons with PTSD, from military service, assault, to domestic violence. Shauna, I'm happy to turn the floor over to you for our housing panel.
Thank you so much, Christian. It really is an honor to be here. Good morning, everyone. As Christian mentioned, I'm Shauna Tarboro, and I'll be the moderator for the first session today, the Housing Crisis Impact on Women and Families. It really is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We encourage you to visit our website for the full bios of these phenomenal experts. The link will be provided in the chat, and we will also be taking your questions for the panelists later on. So that'll be exciting. So please start placing your questions in the chat. All right. First, we have our panelist, Renee M. Willis, the Senior Vice President for Equity and Diversity and Inclusion at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. In this role, Renee works to ensure that NLIHC's commitment to race, equity, diversity, and inclusion is woven throughout its culture, policies, programs, and practices. Welcome, Renee. Next, we welcome panelist Donald Whitehead, Executive Director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. Donald is recognized countrywide as the leading expert in homelessness. Donald has also served on advisory committees for President Bush, Clinton, and Obama. Welcome, Donald. Thank you. And finally, we have Maria Town, President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. Maria previously served as President Obama's administration, where she managed the White House's engagement with the disability community. Welcome, Maria. So why don't we just dive right in with you, Renee? I've been in housing for about 15, 16 years. And, systemic racism has evolved as the markets change from, classic redlining. What would you say is the redlining of 2022?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so very much for that question, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today. That's a great question. I think, in answering that question, you really have to understand, the structural inequities that were really kind of built over time, and really just continues to evolve, as you said today. And I think, the disparities that we see today really are just really a direct result of these mutually reinforcing federal policies. And so, federal, state, and local governments, for decades, really just systematically implemented these racially discriminatory housing policies that excluded African Americans and others from equal access to housing opportunities and mobility. And as we, as we know, the desire really to own a home, it's deeply ingrained in the American dream and the ethos. Yet homeownership rates for Black and Latinos and other marginalized individuals, are at their lowest rates since the 1980s. And so if we look at like a closer look at the data, especially with homeownership, we see that a significant racial, that there's significant racial and ethnic disparities in homeownership. So we have 72%, like today, 72% of white households are homeowners, compared to 44% of Black and 48% of Latino households. And, for most households, especially households of color, home equity really represents the most considerable portion of their wealth holdings. And, however, with the wealth potential and tax benefits of home ownership, they're not equally experienced in the United States. And then, that's just home ownership. So if we look at, the rental housing and rental market, and what redlining, has done in terms of housing in general, we look at nationally, Black households account for 13% of all households, but 26% of all extremely low income renters and 40% of people experiencing homelessness, right? If we take a look at Latino or Latinx households, they account for 12% of all US households, 21% of extremely low income renters, yet 22% of people experiencing homelessness. And then, Native Americans are dramatically overrepresented among people experiencing homelessness. And so when we look at these disparities, really that have been created and sustained through discriminatory practices, we go back to redlining, and we look at redlining and what has happened through the decades. And I think, if again, it's the federal government, in the 30s, deciding, which neighborhoods were considered desirable and eligible for government-backed mortgage insurance. And then based on these decisions, these decisions, which were critical also to lenders, they really just took a look at the racial composition of neighborhoods, determining which neighborhoods were considered, high risk. And for decades, we saw this, not just the federal government, but the governments throughout, local governments, state governments, but also banks. It was the collusion of banks as well for many, many decades, and still now, many of the banks, US banks deny mortgages to people, mostly people of color in urban areas, really preventing them from buying a home in certain neighborhoods or getting a loan to renovate their house or their homes. And that has severe impact.
Right. And can you speak to how technology is either helping or hindering the process to racial equity in housing?
In terms of, you mean in technology with respect to,
Like you have, it's, you can search and apply online nowadays. Is that helping or is that hindering?
yeah, I think in many cases it's hindering. I think, we have certainly come far in terms of technology, and that people with low incomes, for the most part, have access to cell phones, and able to access, the internet. But I think in terms of sometimes this is, the mechanisms that are needed to access, these properties, especially. Um, it really does, I think, hinder in many cases access, and creates just, again, this inequality in accessing housing, which is very, very problematic.
Right. So if we don't have access to housing many times or resources, many times that ends up in homelessness or having to families live together. Donald, what in your experience, many people experiencing homelessness due to different problems, what do you find is the most maybe prevalent problem that you see that lands people in homelessness?
So there's a couple of different kinds of issues that people face, and it depends on which population you're talking about. The overwhelming majority of the population is people who experience episodic homelessness. So their homelessness is short in length, and they sometimes cycle in and out. The two biggest reasons, although stereotypes and people will bring up other issues that are behavioral and sometimes medical issues, the two biggest reasons are the lack of affordable housing and poverty. So if you look at the report that comes out every year by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Out of Reach, what you'll find in that report is there's not one community in the entire United States where a person working a minimum wage job can afford a two-bedroom housing unit. So when you talk about families, women and children, there's nowhere in this country where a person working the best job that they can get based on their skills and education can find a place to live. That is at the level where the federal government says you should pay 30% of your income for rent. So most of the people who are working at a minimum wage job cannot afford to have housing almost anywhere in the United States. And even one bedroom apartments, only a small portion of this country, if you're working a minimum wage job, can you afford a housing unit if you work that job. And again, this is the best job that people can get. Nine of the occupations in this country that pay minimum wages, you can't afford a housing unit at that wage. So that's one issue. The other issue, and one we tend to discount, is just employment and poverty. And really, there's only one program that the federal government administers that provides training and job placement for people that's homeless, people that are homeless, and that only can be accessed by veterans. So we have a housing production problem in this country. So people will come up with a lot of other reasons people are homeless, but the big issue is that we have a housing production issue. There are millions of people on waiting lists for housing. Only 1 out of 4 people that are eligible for subsidized housing actually get that housing. We have millions of people on waiting lists, and the only reason there's not more people is most of those waiting lists are closed. It takes you on average about 2.5 years to get into a public housing unit. So those are the biggest causes. Now, of course, there are other things that people are affected by. Behavioral health issues, substance abuse issues are part of the issue, the reasons why people become homeless. But people who are severely disabled by those issues only make up about 10 to 20% of the population.
Mhm.
So when people see homelessness, they see the visible homeless population. They see the people who are out for longer periods of time. They've been labeled chronically homeless. I don't like that term because I don't think it really
It's not a
it doesn't
disease.
apply personhood to the issue. So it's people
Right.
experiencing homelessness for long periods of time. There are solutions to that issue. Housing First is one of those solutions. A permanent supportive housing. It works and studies have said that it works up to 90% of the time in keeping people in housing. And so it is an effective approach, but it's not the only approach. And we need to have an approach that really gives us the coverage for everybody in America that needs housing. In my belief, it's my organization's belief that housing should be a human right in this country. And it is in most of the developed world, almost all of the developed world, housing is a human right. It's not in the United States. And that's why people are homeless. And I see a question about explaining what Housing First is. It's a program where people who cannot afford to live on their own, they don't have the ability because of those behavioral health issues, they are given housing. Instead of going through a program which may disqualify them, the housing comes first. And then the other issues are addressed. So it's housing and services, it's mental health services, it's addiction services, it's other services that are delivered in the household, because we know it's much better to do that in a housing unit than to try to do that in an encampment or on the street. And what we find is not only do those people stay in housing, their outcomes for mental health, their outcomes for addiction, all of that gets better. Their health gets better. And so it actually saves communities money when you provide this resource. However, the issue is there's a couple of issues. So we're talking about racial equity. What we're finding is that there's a disproportionate amount of people of color who are able to access that housing. There is a prioritization tool that has been found to have racial inequities in it. So basically, when you use this tool and you prioritize people for housing, although the overrepresentation of people of color exists, people of color are not prioritized for that housing at the same rate as their percentage of the population. So I could go on and on about that, but I don't want
And
to
we
leave
will
other
get
people
into
time. So
we will get
I will
into
stop.
that some more. Absolutely. And I love this panel. You guys we're all on the same page. We're all nodding. And I want to bring you into this conversation, Maria, because I've worked with, I file housing discrimination complaints. And one of the things I find is the cases that are the biggest challenge are men or women, but people of color who have disabilities, who have children with disabilities, and they're terrified of losing their housing, even though they realize discrimination is happening. So Maria, can you speak to how can we get past these barriers and support people who are having multiple challenges, including disabilities on top of everything?
Shauna, first, thank you for your work. Your story reveals what we know to be true based on the data, which is that the majority of housing discrimination claims are disability-related claims. And I also think your story is so important to highlight. We may not be speaking about, individual renters with disabilities, but families who either have a disabled child or multi-generational living arrangements where you have disabled older adults in your home. And there are huge issues whenever there is a concern about discrimination, any kind of emergency or disaster, because there is so little accessible housing stock, much less affordable accessible housing stock, that people often feel trapped. And they wind up not being able to leave very dangerous situations, again, whether as a result of discrimination or, I'm from South Louisiana. I worked in Houston for a long time, not being able to leave a home that's been flooded and is contaminated with mold because there's nowhere else to go. And so building on some of what Mr. Whitehead mentioned, one of the huge issues we face is that rapid rehousing programs are often very discriminatory towards people with disabilities. A recent example of this is Project Roomkey in Los Angeles, which was responding to the fires in California. In their program guidance, they would not accept anyone with a significant disability, and that means people with physical and sensory disabilities, as well as those with serious mental illness. And so if someone is brave enough to leave housing that was previously stable, they really do risk entering this cycle of housing instability and homelessness that is very hard to end. One of the things that I think is important to note when we're talking about housing and people with disabilities is that the Americans with Disabilities Act does not apply to private dwellings, okay? That's the Fair Housing Act. And the reason I point that out is because that is a very important distinction for individuals to be aware of as we learn about and advocate for our rights. One of the first things that a difficult landlord will use to shut you down is when you say that you can't do this, it's against the ADA. Well, they say, no, I don't have to comply with the ADA. What they don't say is, yeah, I'm probably violating the Fair Housing Act, right?
Right.
So in an apartment, for example, there may be a required number of accessible units, but that number is determined by the Fair Housing Act. And again, similar to what Mr. Whitehead mentioned, those units don't have to go to disabled people. And the same is true in public and affordable housing. One of the other important kind of legal tools that we have, it is something called the Olmstead decision of 1999. And this is actually where the ADA comes into housing. The Olmstead decision prevents the forced institutionalization of people with disabilities. And so if you have someone who, again, needs to leave housing because they've been discriminated against but can't find accessible housing, sometimes they end up in a nursing home, institution, or a carceral setting. One of the things we know is that nursing home kind of use is growing in communities of color and is shrinking in white communities. And what this says to me is that people of color have a harder time accessing what we call home and community-based services. These are services that allow people to live, love, and thrive in their communities. And it's things like assistance getting out of bed, eating, sometimes it's assistance going to work. And our healthcare system has made it much harder for individuals and families to access and pay for home and community-based services as opposed to going into a nursing home. So what we need to be doing in order to increase housing stability for disabled people and our families and our children is expanding and increasing access to home and community-based services. And that's there's multi-prongs to approach this problem. Just as there are millions of people on wait lists for accessible, affordable housing, there are millions of people on wait lists for HCBS. We have an increasing number of children going into nursing homes because they can't access HCBS. And if we expand access to home and community-based services,
Okay.
And if in expanding access to these services, that also means raising the wages for the vital workforce that provides these services, who are predominantly women of color, and many of whom are also disabled women of color. Right now, most personal care attendants, direct support workers make $12 an hour and are forced to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. They are not provided with any job security or benefits, and they could be living in a very different part of town than the families or individuals that they support. When we think about inclusive communities, for me, that's about accessible and affordable housing, that's about inclusive schools, that's about anti-ableist, anti-racist crisis response, but that's also ensuring that the community itself can support one another. So workers who are supporting disabled people can live close to one another. Teachers can live in the same communities as their students. One of the things that I think can really, if we take this broad lens of sort of inclusive community development, shifting gears a little bit, one of the things we need to stop doing is basing education budgets on property taxes. What that means is that schools in neighborhoods where there is a lower property tax base often get the short end of the stick when it comes to services and supports for students with disabilities. And so even in a place like Washington, DC, where I cannot afford to buy a house, right? If I was the parent of a disabled child, my child would likely be bused to a school in Maryland or Virginia, right? In order to provide them with support. What does that mean for me and where I live and where my child lives? We need to end these practices. Anyway,
Yeah.
I will stop there.
Thank you for that. No, thank you. That was wonderful. I appreciate it. It was really robust answer. I'd like to open this up to the whole panel because you guys have such a wealth of understanding, and I know you can all speak to this. I wanted to talk a little bit about gentrification, like you were alluding to, Maria, like food deserts, resource deserts. What can we do to really support people? What are the major factors contributing to the racial equity gap when it comes to housing? And you can talk about all of those things: gentrification, redlining, program access. Anybody can go first.
I could start on a couple of those topics. It's all most of those issues: the food deserts, the health deserts, the financial institution deserts are a product of redlining, and the intentional segregation by the federal government on communities of color. We could also talk about public housing, which was intentionally segregated at its beginnings. So there was Black public housing, there was white public housing, and the government itself was the culprit in structural racism. So since that time, what we've seen is because a lot of the property owners in those communities were not able to, and the African American and other people of color, other immigrants were involved in this as well. Since they weren't able to insure properties, many of those properties got lost. And when gentrification happens, it's those communities that are gentrified. And that is another reason we've seen an increase in homelessness because a lot of those communities, people are priced out of those communities. And you don't see the banking institutions, the jobs, or the healthcare facilities come in until those communities are emptied out. One thing we didn't talk about, which is another clear redlining issue, is zoning practices. So many communities that are affluent do not allow multifamily units in those communities. And if you do that, you're discriminating against people that have to find rental housing. I really love Maria's point about our school system. That's where it starts at. We have inadequate schools. We have inadequate discipline in those schools. Brown and Black girls are more likely to receive discipline in the school system. So they start off with a deficit. We haven't talked about the criminal justice system. All of those things are feeder systems to the homeless system. We haven't talked about the foster care system. So there are so many different issues that contribute to homelessness that need to be fixed. And when we had the crisis a little while ago, the crisis with home ownership and people in foreclosure, the communities that were in foreclosure and the community that there were predatory lending practices in were communities of color. And so we're talking about history, but we're also talking about current history because we
Excuse
know.
me, you're also not just the discrimination in lending, but in the programs that
Yes.
are helping people avoid foreclosure. I found discrimination there as well.
Absolutely. And I was just going to say that we have seen uh, banks, we've seen mortgage companies actually being sued recently. I mean, in the last 5 years for practices that we thought had been eliminated years ago. So I won't name names, but there was a bank in Baltimore that was redlining in 2019. They actually were fined millions of dollars. I mean, in the last few months, we've seen multiple times where there's a mixed race couple and the white man or the white woman gets their house appraised, and it's significantly higher than if
Right.
the other member of that family gets it appraised. So we have a long way to go to get to resolution. One thing I will say is I do see for the first time some significant movement to make equitable practices within the homeless arena. So many programs are assessing their data. They're looking at it isn't just who goes into housing, it's who's putting people into housing, it's who's doing outreach. It's the fact that we often see in social service agencies at the forefront, on the front line, we see people of color. But if we go up the ladder to leadership, there's not much color up there. And then if you go into the philanthropic community, only 7% of the foundation support in this country go to organizations led by people of color. So there's a whole lot of things that we need to fix. And I'll stop there, but we have a lot of work to do along those lines. But COVID showed us what happens when you don't have hospitals or you have jobs on the front line, and you also don't have resources for healthcare. That's why so many people of color were affected by COVID. All of these issues are interconnected and have caused to us to be in the situation we are today. So I'm going to stop there and let our
Thank you
other.
for that. Yeah, and Renee, how can these predominantly Black, brown, immigrant neighborhoods, how can they attract investors to help establish these basic needs?
That's actually a hard question because
Yeah.
I think really as like a nation, we've made a choice, right? We've made a choice to really largely ignore the evidence about, the benefits of creating neighborhoods in which everyone can thrive. And I think, we've declined to fund things like, parks and place-based interventions like affordable housing and things of that nature. But clean and accessible parks, for instance, it shouldn't be a luxury reserved for those living in like affluent,
Right.
mostly white neighborhoods that have benefited from decades, decades of intentional government-backed investments, right? And so I think when we talk about like how, I'm going to be honest, I don't know, how we can how these communities that are marginalized can attract investors, and to do so in an equitable way without there being gentrification, because I think we have to change, I think, as a society what we value, and the first step really is shifting perception so that people see people of color as human beings, right, and as having equitable opportunity for housing and wealth, I think is the first shift. Because when you think about community development, you think it's a process where community members are involved. It's not just shouldn't be just developers coming in. It should be, the full community involved. Because you really want to make sure that it's a process where community members are supported by the agencies, the local governments and local jurisdictions, state jurisdictions as well, to identify and really take action and really to address the issues that are important to that community without displacing that community.
Right. Very good. Well, I would talk to you guys all day, but I need to open it up to questions to the group for the panelists. So let's do that. They're going to help me with the with accessing these questions here. Okay. Let's see, how can, okay. So so this one question is a huge question. So I'll just read it as it is. How can single child free senior violence survivors get compensated for the time required to pursue equal access to public services while healing? And why should we pay banks interest on subsistence food and shelter loans while writing letters and appeals of denials? Going up the chain. Okay, so let's just talk about trauma and trying to access public services. I've found that oftentimes property management companies don't know what to do when there's domestic violence. They don't know what, and they, now we have some laws that don't kick out both parties, both the perpetrator and the victim. Does anybody want to speak to that? How to access, or are there programs that help people who have been traumatized access services? Anybody? Can you hear me?
This is Maria. This is an excellent question, and unfortunately, I don't have super tangible answers to it. But I'll add a layer, which is the need for culturally competent trauma response systems, and I'm specifically thinking about LGBTQIA seniors of color who may have experienced domestic violence. I also, this is a little bit of a tangent, but one of our programs awards emerging leaders in the disability rights and disability justice community. And one of our awardees from last year specifically set up a program to provide stipends for students who are having to fight ableism in schools. And it would be very interesting to see other types of programs modeled after his for different communities as they are trying to survive trauma. One of the things that I wish we could stop is requiring individuals to tell their stories over and over and over again to determine their eligibility for key supports and services, so that our systems themselves stop re-traumatizing both individuals and those support workers who are trying to facilitate services. But I don't have a great answer to their wonderful question.
But that's good. That's one of the things that I tell people is write down your narrative, write down your story so that you don't have to keep retelling it to every single stranger who, may or may not be able to help you. Yeah, that's a good point. That's great. And the chat's kind of filled with a lot of stuff. I think they're going to text me some specific questions, but while we're talking about this, what one thing do each of you have or can propose as a step in the right direction to solving these issues of inequity in housing? And you can stick to your particular wheelhouse. Do you want to start with that, Donald?
I can start because I think we've created a path to a solution. The National Coalition, in partnership with NOW, and I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Christian Nunez for her movement and compassion in the homeless arena, because we haven't had that before. And I think that the organization being a part of the movement really gives it some strength. So what we've done with NOW and the National Low Income Housing Coalition and other partners is we've created the Bring America Home Now campaign. And it's a campaign that's really designed to address the structural issues, housing, income, health, and also civil and racial injustice issues. So we're in the process, because what I know and what I see right now is that there is a lot of talk in this moment. There was an inflection point. The Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, there was an inflection point. People start talking directly about structural racism and injustice in this country, but we can't let that be a fleeting moment.
Right.
And the only way we cannot have that become a fleeting moment is push the envelope so these issues are being addressed on a regular basis. So what we're doing is we've done talking about it. We're really looking at policy to change it. So a couple of things we're working on right now is, it would probably surprise people to know that in 1998, there was an amendment that stopped the development of public housing. It was called the Faircloth Amendment. And that amendment stopped public housing in its tracks. So you can't repair public housing, you can't build public housing. That's one of the things that we absolutely have to work on. We think that if we are able to make housing a human right, and the closest thing we can do that, the closest way we can do that is to make the subsidized housing or housing choice voucher program an entitlement. So there's a couple of pieces of legislation that are out there. There should be no wrong door. If you need housing in the United States, especially if you're working the hardest you can at the best job you can get, you should be able to get it. But we also, there's so many other issues, but we have this campaign to really look at it structurally, not myopic solutions that only meet part of the population, but a comprehensive strategy to really address all of the issues we've talked about today.
Right.
So that's the Bring America Home Now. I hope that people join our campaign. The website is bringamericahome.org, bringamericahomenow.org. Please join our campaign. We need everyone. We can't keep asking Congress for stuff. We got to force Congress to make change. We gotta have our voices loud enough that they hear us, and they know that there's enough people out there that want change in this country, and that's how we change it.
Excellent, thank you. How about you, Renee?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with everything Donald said. And I think that, I think if advocates really want to be more intentional about how they bring a racial equity lens to their work, it's really understanding the function of racism. And as Donald talked about, it's really focusing on the systemic racism, on the policies, all of those things that have been, baking, if you will, for centuries, actually. But also it's using the data to show, the housing disparities, the evidence of housing disparities that we've seen across the board. And, a very important piece of this really is including people of color and others with marginalized identities in the process, because I think that they need to be the architects of the solution. And I think if we remember that as advocates, I think that we'll see change, throughout as far as affordable housing in this country.
I love that, architects of the solution, because we weren't architects of the problem.
Exactly.
We built this joint, but we didn't create the structure. Okay, and Maria, I really wanted to hear from you, and also about if not school tax based off of the housing base, what do you propose?
I think there are a variety of models we can look at to better fund education that isn't tied to property tax. And I'm sorry, getting a breakout rooms bump, but I want to highlight a couple of really tangible suggestions that I think can help.
Great, you have 1 minute. I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry. So we need to increase state and local programs for home modifications. Right now, all of these programs are overtaxed and have decades-long waiting lists.
Yep.
And then two other things that are very much on my mind are what we call healthy cities and smart cities. Healthy cities are typically defined by walkability, reduced rates of things like diabetes, asthma, and obesity. In my mind, what that means is that a healthy city is one where disability isn't present. Disability is a natural part of the human condition, and it does not mean the absence of health. Communities of color experience greater rates of disability because of things like decades-long environmental racism. And so when we think about promoting healthy communities, they should be communities where disability is embraced, not eradicated. Yes. Similarly with smart cities are going to just increase cost for individuals. They're going to create further barriers that we don't fully understand because there is no ADA for the World Wide Web, web-based apps, or anything electronic. And they will also increase surveillance. Increased surveillance comes with increased policing and law enforcement, particularly for disabled people of color. So those are two things very much on my mind that we have to be vigilant in preventing.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for taking our questions. I encourage everyone to follow these wonderful speakers on social media. Their handles will be placed in the chat. It's really been a pleasure moderating with you guys today. We'll now take a brief break, but please join us again in 5 minutes for our next panel on reproductive rights. Thank you, guys.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much. We are going to move into our second panel of the day, which is focused on reproductive justice. As you know, this last year has been an assault on reproductive justice for women, reproductive rights. And so this panel is a much needed panel to discuss the intersections of race and reproductive justice. Reproductive rights has long been the crown jewel of the far right's attack on women. Masquerading as a crusade to preserve life, their extreme position is a thinly veiled red herring that they're trying to do to control women's rights by stripping away the fundamental right to bodily autonomy. But no draconian legislation, even overturning Roe versus Wade, will ever prevent women from getting abortions. And it will only just impose crippling and dangerous burdens of low-income women and women of color to have access that they truly deserve. So this discussion we're having today is so important and so crucial because we know that these laws that are trying to be passed are having a direct impact on marginalized communities of women and women of color. And we know if the Supreme Court overturns Roe, it will perpetuate the systemic racism in the healthcare system that kills thousands of women of color in the United States each year. As a country with over one of the highest rates of Black maternal mortality rates in the world, we should know that increasing access to more health-related services by providers and resources is important, not eliminating them. And we know that eliminating these services makes it even more dangerous for women of color. So it is our duty to make sure that we continue to advocate and we continue to look for resources and pass laws that are helping and not restricting. So our expert panelists today are here to give us some great tools to look at holistically what we can do for reproductive justice. Our panelists will help us evaluate the current state of reproductive justice and reproductive rights, discuss what a post-Roe world will look like and what activists are doing to fight back. But first, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our featured keynote speaker for this panel, Alexis McGill-Johnson, the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America and Fund. Planned Parenthood provides vital services to more than 2.4 million people each year through more than 600 healthcare centers across the country. Alexis is a champion for social and racial justice, a respected political and cultural organizer, and a tireless advocate for reproductive justice and freedom. She has been with Planned Parenthood's leadership for more than a decade as a PPF board chair and Planned Parenthood Action Fund board member. So please help me welcome Alexis.
Hello now. I am Alexis McGill Johnson, President and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, and I am so grateful to get the chance to talk to you about the state of reproductive health rights and justice, because let's be real, it is in a crisis. You've all heard what's going on in Texas. It's been 175 days since Texans could access abortion after approximately 6 weeks, before many people even know they're pregnant. That's 6 months almost. Already this legislative session, Florida, Arizona, Ohio, Wisconsin, South Dakota, Alabama, Oklahoma, and Missouri are considering copycat legislation. And of course, the Supreme Court is considering Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, a case that could unravel Roe and the right to abortion once and for all. A majority of justices seem poised to at least let the Mississippi 15-week ban stand, if not repeal Roe outright. Either way, we have never been closer to losing a fundamental constitutional right. And if Roe falls or is rendered meaningless, 26 states could move immediately to ban abortion. That would affect 36 million women and even more people who can become pregnant. We know what a world without Roe looks like. We are seeing it right now in Texas, and frankly, in a lot of other states where abortion has been restricted nearly out of existence. The day after SB 8 went into effect, 100% of patients at the Albuquerque Health Center were from Texas. The number of abortions dropped by 60% in the next month, meaning more than half of people are either traveling out of state or continuing pregnancies against their will. We don't know exact numbers yet, but we know based on how many folks are coming to health centers in other states from Texas that people are going without the abortions they need. These bans are coming to a legislature near you. And when they do, we know who is going to bear the burden. Black, Indigenous, and Latino communities, the LGBTQ+ community, people with low incomes, especially in the South and Midwest. The people least likely to be able to afford a pregnancy are the same people least likely to be able to afford gas money, the time off work, childcare, all the things you need to travel hundreds or even thousands of miles to access abortion. Because we cannot separate the system that denies people's freedom to access abortion and the system that denies the humanity, dignity, and power of Black and Brown people, they are one and the same. It's not a coincidence that Black women have maternal mortality rates that are 3 times as high as white women. Our healthcare system is constructed on inequity. It is not a coincidence that the architects of the most egregious abortion bans are also behind attacks on voting rights, marriage equality, trans youth, COVID mandates, and teaching actual history in schools. So for Planned Parenthood and other organizations across the country, the most important thing we can do right now is center the desires, needs, hopes, and dreams of the people at the center of those attacks. To respond equitably to this crisis, our actions have to be based on only what they want, not and how they want it. Creating meaningful partnerships with local abortion funds to help people easily afford their care, with other abortion providers so that every possible provider stays available and accessible, and with trusted community partners who can provide wraparound social supports. For decades, the reproductive justice movement has been asking organizations like Planned Parenthood and NOW, organizations that have historically been run by and for white women, to step up. There's a tendency to want to revise where we are today. But I don't want to deal in the if, shoulda, woulda, couldas. We all wish our movement started off intersectionally, but the task today is to make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes of the past. Black women and women of color have been central, but they have not been centered in the movement for reproductive rights, justice, and freedom. As organizations with big voices and big supporters, what is our responsibility? Well, the first task on our list is making people believe that the sky is falling, because it absolutely is. While 80% of people want abortion to remain legal, just 33% of voters polled recently believe that Roe is going to be overturned. So let that sink in. While abortion is essentially outlawed in the 2nd largest state in the country, and the majority of sitting Supreme Court justices have said they are totally okay with that, people still do not think that the constitutional right to abortion will be taken away in the US in 2022. And we have to address why that believability gap exists. Roe just turned 49. Generations of women have grown up believing that their rights were irreversibly enshrined in the law, not understanding that for Black and brown folks, Roe was always a right, but only in name only. The believability gap rests on the empathy gap. Whose lives are going to be affected by the dissolution of Roe are the people for whom society oftentimes has the least empathy. We know no matter what the nuances of the court's decision in the Jackson Women's Health case are, it is going to be a loss. All of us will have a lot of work to do to raise the alarm in our communities because there's no action without urgency. We're all feeling the weight of this moment, the pandemic, our democracy, our humanity, our dignity. I know it is a lot. So I want to leave you with the hope that is sustaining me. The silver lining of this moment is the opportunity to reimagine, to rebuild the infrastructure of our rights and freedoms around a new standard. We can build a multiracial, multi-ethnic, intergenerational movement to make it happen, with state and grassroots BIPOC leadership where the voices most impacted drive our decision-making, inclusive and expansive, built on belonging, not just inclusion. I'm not saying it's going to be easy because we know we are living in dark times, but movements exist because of darkness. It is our job to imagine the light, even when we cannot see it. We can't wait for the courts to determine the future for us. We can't be complacent. No matter what happens, Planned Parenthood will be in the street and we will be there for the people who need us. We will be in partnership with the folks who will be leading these efforts. And I hope to see you all out there. I'm so grateful to be here with you, Christian, and celebrate your leadership in this really critical moment. And to the panelists, I wish you a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you so much for your leadership and Planned Parenthood for all the work that you've been doing on the ground and in the halls of power. Now plans to continue to work with you all to make sure that we're ensuring equal access to reproductive freedom. This is so inspiring. We know the work we have to do for reproductive rights to make sure we're making an intersectional, equal, intergenerational, and multiracial movement. And protecting those who most need these services. So it is now my pleasure. I'm very excited to bring to you the next moderator, who is an upcoming leader and now for the Reproductive Justice Panel. Her name is Joy Dean. She's a co-chair of our now Young Feminist National Committee. Joy is a recent graduate from Florida Atlantic University, where she was integral in launching the Schools Now chapter. And she also serves on the executive board as a member of the American Marketing Association. We are excited to welcome you, Joy. We are excited to see what your future holds, and she is going to do amazing work facilitating this panel. So I turn the floor over to you, Joy.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Christian, for your kind words. As Christian mentioned, my name is Joy Dean, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Representative Justice Panel. And I want to go ahead and introduce some of our panelists. So we encourage you to visit our website for full bios of these phenomenal experts. The link will be provided in the chat. We'll also be taking your questions for our panelists, so please begin placing those in the chat. So let's get started. So our first panelist is Shakita Lockley, producer and director of the forthcoming documentary, Eggs Over Easy, Black Women in Fertility. She is also the producer of the award-winning documentary, Kunta Kinte Island, Coming Home Without Shackles. She specializes in live event production, providing creative direction for numerous national events, including work for the Human Rights Campaign and Stacey Abrams. Welcome, Shakita. Next, we welcome Cindy Luquin, a certified bilingual sexual health expert and founder of Howl at the Womb, which provides trainings and workshops specializing in gender, pleasure, and wellness. Welcome, Cindy. Finally, we are very pleased to welcome Farah Tania, co-executive director of Black Women's Blueprint, which seeks to provide services and spaces for healing, reconciliation, and human connection with the natural world. Working with land, they provide people together to design and practice strategies for healing, health, and reparative economics. Welcome, Farah. So we're going to get started. I have some questions that will be for the panel at large and specific targeted questions. So my first question is for everyone. Feel free to answer whatever you feel called to. So the first one is, why does the US have one of the highest Black maternal mortality rates in the world?
Well, I can jump in. So, hello everybody, and thanks so much for having me. Hello, Joy. I'm Shaquita Lockley. As part of my research for the documentary, that number 243% mortality, maternal mortality rate was staggering. And so I did do somewhat of a deep dive. And at the end of the day, doctors are not listening to us. And then there are some practical things that just aren't happening. So when a woman, a Black woman goes in and is in pain, and the doctor says, how much pain, or what is your pain level from 1 to 10? And she says a 4. If it's not a Black doctor, many times that 4 is interpreted as a 2. If a white woman goes in and says a 4, it's interpreted as an 8. And so they will treat one woman with medicine to actually make sure she lives. And then the Black woman, they may give her an aspirin. So during the window of my research, what was happening is a lot of Black women who have a baby, they're postpartum, they're sent home, they get a headache, they call into the doctor, they're given aspirin or Aleve or whatever pain medicine, when actually their blood pressure is sky high and they're stroking out and dying. So that is like literally research that has been happening. And it could be as simple as doctors paying attention to what all of their patients are saying. It could be as simple as doctors checking their implicit bias and treating a woman who looks like me the way they would treat a white woman, so that we all can walk out alive. It could be as simple as putting blood pressure cuffs in a bag when you send them home with the diapers and the little baby bundle. Put a blood pressure cuff in there. So when they call in with a headache, you'll know, is this a headache? Because maybe it's just pollen season. Or is this a headache because this woman might be having a stroke? And we just don't look at what should be simple things. We don't look at them. And so we keep dying. And until people like us speak louder, and in more places, I don't know how change will be effective.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you. Anybody else want to talk about this question?
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think,
And hi,
you know,
everyone. My
from
name
the
is Cindy
perspective.
Lupine.
Go ahead, please.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I can chime in. I think just going off of what Chiquita was saying, that there's a lot of just implicit biases when people go in, and Black women go in and they're not heard, and their pain level is not interpreted the same way. And there's just understanding that the medical system and medical racism is still present. And just because it's not overt, just because it wasn't done the way it was back then, or like eugenics and things like that, doesn't mean that that biases still aren't present. And I think it's excuse me, I think it's the responsibility of these organizations, and even I would say on an individual level of the medical provider themselves, the doctor, to seek out training, to seek out how to best improve, to seek out their colleagues, their brown and Black colleagues, to understand how to best show up for their patients and how to best understand what's going on, and to check their own implicit biases. I think it's just a lifetime's work to do that. And it's never going to be perfect, but I think making the effort to do that and understand and look at the data that backs that up, instead of just thinking it's somebody who's feeling something and there's no research. There's tons of research out there if you look for it, and just understanding that, and so you can better show up for this and stop this from happening, because it's terrible that it's happening. And so hopefully those things can help reduce what's going on. Also understanding how, you know, your patients communicate and get information, I think is really important too. The people that are present in their lives as well, and who can understand what's going on in their lives too. I think we forget that patients are just not living their lives independently. They have a whole family or a whole community that works with them. And those people care about them. So including those people in their health care plan is just as important as well.
Thank you for that. And I think that, this is such an important question. I hope I'm unmuted. I am. And thank you for asking it. I think one of the things, the way that I would answer that is that we simply need to look at who is dying the most, who is experiencing the highest levels of maternal morbidity and maternal mortality, right? Who is experiencing, the least, the less safe sort of interactions throughout the spectrum of OBGYN care, right? And who are the communities most impacted when you have, certain types of anti-abortion bills or anything that impacts communities that already have a lack of access to healthcare. And that's Black women, that's Indigenous women, it's the BIPOC community, it is the trans community, it is all of our communities that are disenfranchised. So when you think about this, when you think about who's most impacted, we have to look at gender, as you just said, Cindy, right? We look at gender, we look at the discrimination. Examining racism, socioeconomic status, and educational status without gender discrimination is an obvious blind spot here. Without discrimination around sexuality and gender identity is also a blind spot. And it contributes, to maternal mortality. It contributes to maternal morbidity. Dr. Geronimus talks about the theory of weathering, right, which provides a framework for us to begin to understand, the chronic threats that are superimposed, right, the continuous accumulation of abuse, of stress, of racism, of sexism, of all the other phobias and other oppressions that really impact, not only the mental health of birthing people, but also that impact the outcome, their outcomes in medical care. The doctors and the medical professionals are not exempt. They're not immune, from the discrimination and the, white supremacy and patriarchy that exists out in the world. And we see that play out, and we see the consequences in maternal mortality and morbidity, and the removal, the denial of healthcare, to certain communities.
Thank you so much. That makes total sense. I do have a follow-up question for Chiquita. How do we encourage Black people to speak up and advocate for themselves when their health and their concerns have historically been ignored?
Thank you for that. So it's a tricky question because we don't trust the system, and we have reason not to trust the system from slavery until now. But not trusting the system doesn't end with us being our healthiest selves or our best selves. So we look for solutions, and in looking for solutions, I believe that the best way is to educate our women who are going in, particularly Black girls, because if we look at news cycles, there's a certain trope of what Black girls are, who Black girls are. So when we take time to see them, not as the news tells us to, but actually see them as people, and then give them language to go in and advocate for themselves. So last summer, my team, we did a soft launch on an initiative called Ask Early. And the whole point of it is to get communities, the grandmas, the aunties, the moms, the mentors, wrapped around this notion of if we give them the language, they will know how to advocate for themselves. So for me, I was in my early 40s, the first time a doctor ever said I shouldn't be in the bed for one day every month with my period cramps. I didn't know, because all my friends have been in bed since high school or middle school or junior high, whenever their cycle starts. So we're in the bed on the first day because we have bad cramps. I knew to go to the doctor and ask for pain medicine. I didn't know I should ask why, what is the root of this? Because you can fix something if you know what it is. If not, you're just going to medicate it and just put some medicine, put a leave on it. When actually it was fibroids, which upwards of 80% of Black women will have fibroids by the age of 50, an absurd number. And there's not enough research to find a way like a pill to just help us. So instead, we end up in hysterectomies, which Black women globally are the largest demographic for hysterectomies. For those who don't know, that's the removal of your uterus and your ovaries, your reproductive organs. And globally, around the world, we're the #1 demographic for being gutted, essentially. So when you just start looking at how do we see the huge, like the largesse of this problem, how do we attack it in the most positive way? And that is just to give us the words, the language to know what to ask for. And if we know what to ask for, we can advocate for ourselves. There's no reason I was early 40s finding out half the stuff. Once I started researching for the documentary, I found out tons of stuff. All of this stuff I should have known from at least mid-20s, because we can't expect junior high to teach you everything in sex ed, which is a topic we don't have enough time for today. But we should know certain things about our bodies, like our AMH, it's your anti-Müllerian hormone. If you ever want to have kids, they're going to start there to let you know whether or not you have like viable eggs and that sort of thing. And we don't even know to ask. So if we give them the language, that's like permission, and it gives like a certain level of comfort so they can walk in and advocate for themselves.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I love what you had to say about giving them the language at an early age. I did have a question for Farah as well. So with your work, Black Women's Blueprint, you talk a lot about decolonizing health. Can you elaborate on that concept?
Unmute. There it is. Thank you. Thank you so much. When we think about decolonizing health, right, and we think about decolonizing health by organizing and really empowering not only those most impacted, but also the midwives, right, who could be some of our best allies. Also, the sort of the sexual health workers, the doulas, right, who can be some of our strongest allies. It means really looking at body sovereignty and really putting the power, as Chiquita said, in the hands of those most impacted. It means disrupting, again, gender. It means taking extraordinary measures to reify what we're calling body sovereignty, right? So which encompasses the right to make decisions over our own bodies, even in interaction with systems like medical care, where we go for healthcare services, where we are, taught that, some doctors are God, right? They make decisions over our lives. They tell us, what we have to do. I think that there has to be an active dismantling of the system. I mean, this is a feminist space, so we can talk about what we need. I want to be as authentic and as transparent as possible in terms of where we stand when we talk about working with midwives, when we talk about working in collaboration with oppression abolitionists, with trans and intersex healers, all of these marginalized communities coming together. That is how we reify body sovereignty. That is how we start decolonizing the healthcare system, getting the doctors, getting the medical care professionals to become allies in the abolishment of racism and patriarchy inside of medical care. There's got to be an active dismantling. There's got to be that administrative advocacy. There's got to be more policy, more accountability for healthcare facilities and the clinics, that are responsible for, that provide services, to our folks. But a lot of that means we got to tell our stories. And I see that that's being done. We need to tell more of our stories. We need to mobilize more of those of us that are impacted. And we need to do it in partnership by de-siloing, our movements. And really, that is how we're going to decolonize, the healthcare system.
Thank you so much for that. I kind of want to turn gears slightly to abortion access. As we know, reproductive rights is not only pregnancy, but access to abortion abortion and reproductive care and inclusive sex ed, things like that. So I want to ask you guys, is there any chance that Roe survives, Roe v. Wade survives? If Roe miraculously does survive, what's next? Do we wait for the next challenge? And what would a post-Roe world look like? I know there was kind of a lot of questions in one, so whoever wants to tackle one or two of those, go for it.
So I heard the speaker for this, our primary speaker for this panel mention that people don't, but like it's only 33% of people who believe that Roe v. Wade might be overturned, and that is actually scary to me. I wasn't aware of that. I am terrified that it might be overturned. Just looking at the numbers on the Supreme Court, it makes me so nervous. For me, I grew up in a Pentecostal household with my grandma, who was like a Bible thumper and the biggest pro-choice person you would ever meet, because her sister, who was raped at a very young age, ended up having, this was years ago, but had to have an abortion. They did it with a hanger and turpentine, because that is what happens when Black people and marginalized people do not have access to medical care that they need. So when we say, okay, this is what's happening, this is what the Supreme Court looks like, it sends me into a panic attack, because I know that if you're wealthy or your skin is a certain complexion, worst case scenario, you can get a flight to Europe and do whatever your choice is that you decide, have an abortion. If you live on the south side of Chicago, if you live in the west end of Atlanta, if you live in one of the communities in Miami, do you have money to take a flight to Europe to have an abortion? You don't. You're not going to stop abortion. So what it looks like is for colored girls who considered suicide when the rainbow wasn't enough, you're in a back alley and you're dying because you don't have access to medical care. And I look at it, for those who may or may not remember him, Dr. Kenneth Edelin, he was like a pioneer. He was arrested for performing an abortion on a teenage patient who needed it, a couple of months after Roe v. Wade passed. And he was arrested for doing something that was legal, gave his entire life, sat on Planned Parenthood's board for years, just advocating. And this was a Black man advocating for the rights so that we are not dying unnecessarily with these back alley treatments. And so I don't want to rant, but it makes me very, very nervous. And you ask about a post Roe v. Wade. We've done that. It's not even post. It's like we've done that. We had years and years of that. And that's how people die. And that is how you end up with turpentine and hangers, which basically render you unable to have children when you're an adult and actually want to. It's awful. I don't have any more comments, but it just doesn't need to happen.
Yes. Thank you so much, Shakita, for saying that. And going back to what you're saying, when you think about a post Roe versus Wade, like what happens, right? So back in the day, right, we can talk about the antebellum South, we can talk about, medicine on the slave trail on the Underground Railroad. Like, we know that Black women, Black grannies have practiced, and they were brought here with remedies that we have eventually lost, right? Therefore, the turpentine and the hangers. But sexual assault advocates, for example, feminist advocates, for example, in Black communities, in BIPOC communities, are already organizing. They're already mobilizing at the grassroots to revive and relearn and regain access to these remedies. Now, most of us don't know. We weren't there. We don't know. No one taught us. At some point, the knowledge that was being passed down got interrupted. It is no longer being passed down, but we are scrambling to become self-sufficient. We are scrambling to be able to support each other. And what that may mean in a place where, it is illegal to have an abortion is that an increase in the incarceration of Black women who are practicing. This may mean, just increased violence against us, increased really just gender and racial terrorism, honestly, against us, because this right to bodily sovereignty, this right to bodily autonomy the right to ownership, of our own bodies, of our own wombs is taken away from us. And so, it is a scary scenario, that you bring up. It's a scary, scary scenario, but know that we are already organizing, and it's going to mean a complete transformation of how communities respond to women and girls and those who are seeking abortion. And it's going to mean new systems, have to rise up, right? So we can take care of each other and take care of our own, inside of these systems that were not meant to take care of us, right? So that's a scary, scary, scary scenario. And then there's the continuous advocacy that we have to do, right? It means we go harder. It means we go higher. It means we advocate and we're stronger. And again, I keep talking about de-siloing our movements, right? Sexual assault, violence prevention advocates, reproductive health advocates. There is a feminist movement. Now is a feminist organization. This is the time to bring people together and start being proactive. As we advocate for prevention, we also advocate for that time. What are we going to do? We plan, we strategize, we put something in place for what happens next, for that scary future you just asked us about.
Thank you so much for that. Let's see, Cindy, is there anything you wanted to add to that? If not, I have another question for you.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing all that. It's scary, to think about all those things. I think one way that I think about as an educator, I always go back to education, right? And I've seen in many of even my communities as a Latinx person, just educating people about the history of abortion. I think what ends up happening is that a lot of marginalized communities are taught that spiritual morality is a measure of reproductive rights and human rights. And I don't think that that's true, because there's people who, like Shakira was saying, her grandmother was Bible thumping Pentecostal. I grew up with a Pentecostal grandmother as well. And they believed in human rights. They believed in a person to make the decision to terminate a pregnancy if that was something that they weren't able to do, right? That they didn't want to do. Educating in that and understanding how to communicate and have the language. I think that it's been so criminalized and there's this stigma around abortion, and just understanding where that comes from can be a huge, huge stepping stone for a lot of communities, and understanding that it's not sinful. It's not, just to put plain and simple, it's not a sin to do these things. There's no moral gauge for what kind of person you are based on that. And I think that that's really a handicap that I've seen a lot within our communities. And it's also like ableism, right? To think that, well, everybody should. And it's like, well, you're excluding a lot of people, people who may perhaps have disabilities and don't want to have a child, or maybe they do, all these different things and scenarios. And so understanding how Farah was saying, understanding that we need to come together and collaborate and work with each other as providers, as educators, as advocates, as feminists. We can best use our skills and then work together to create a movement that we're still going to be fighting this, post Roe, we're still going to be learning and educating, and it's constantly shifting and pivoting that movement.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I do have one more question and then we'll move on to some audience questions. So what are the most effective ways for allies to fight for women of color specifically?
Allies can use there are probably tons of ways, but something interesting happened. So when June 20th and Black Lives Matter movement started, all of these white people came into my DMs on Instagram to find ways to partner. And what I realized is that not everybody who says they want to partner is actually an ally. So what someone who is an ally can do is not seek all of the information from Black people. Google, research, do your own research, because we have enough stress just trying to manage the lane we're walking in. We cannot educate all of you. So go Google, there are plenty of books, Google, and then come back to the table, share your platform. There's on Clubhouse, plenty of rooms that are like awesome in terms of allyship. One, this guy, his name is Mohit. He's based out of Canada. He has the Health Equities Room, and he has been a wonderful example of what sharing a platform looks like, what being an ally looks like. So that's, I think, if you want to be an ally, follow him and figure out, just kind of see what he's doing. It's a Health Equities Room, but if anyone has a need that they need to discuss, like I needed to discuss before my movie even came out, we were talking about fibroids and what can we do about it. That room has like 40,000 people in it. My room has 1,000. So he shares his platform to say, hey, do you want to do your talk over here? Invite whoever you want. I have all these people. You have access to him if I have access to him. So that is what being an ally. He did not insert himself. He did not say, this is my male opinion on it. He just said, oh, my room is open. If you want all these people in there, I will make the flyer, and this is how I'm going to help. So I think if you want to be an ally, do your own research and then use your platform for good. So that's my take on it.
I think that, for white allies who want to partner or who want to support or who want to be true allies, I think that, of course, as Shakita said, doing the work on your own, yes, and finding the best strategies to work with BIPOC communities by respecting where they are at, by respecting how much space that you can take inside of a BIPOC community movement. One of the things that I witnessed during the Black Lives Matter protest is how white allies put their bodies, in front, right? In a lot of situations, although a lot of our Black brothers and sisters, were harmed during those protests, but they put their bodies in front. It's through an understanding of the historical impact, of the historical harm, that had been done to us, and the continued benefit from those historical harms. I think that that's what motivated a lot of white allies to do that. I think when we look at maternal health, when we look at access to healthcare, access to abortion in communities where it's needed the most, I think the same process, the same concept, applies. Look at historically how it is we got to this place, how it is we got to this place of marginalization and lack of access, and mobilize your access as a white ally, mobilize your resources as a white ally to be in mutuality, authentic mutuality with us, right? Not to co-opt, but to contribute with us, and not just contribute one time. There was also an influx of funding and donations by white allies during, that spring, summer, and then it stopped, right? So thinking about our sustainability is incredibly important, right? I think it was Audre Lorde or one of our Black feminist theorists, ancestors said that, activism is not a one-time event, or justice is not a one-time event. It is continuous. It is through practice. It is through daily practice. It is through daily conversation. As Shakita said, not to insert the self, but to engage in honest dialogue and conversation. We are waiting for that, and to engage in honest dialogue and conversation about how we last beyond this year to do the work that we're doing to ensure the survival of the people in our communities. So that if white allies are ready to have that conversation and be in true mutuality with us, then we are ready to have that conversation with you as well.
I think thinking about what skill set you have and what you can bring to the table, you know, because there might be a need for that within BIPOC spaces, and making an offer, you know. One way that I do that, I've had the privilege of, you know, getting higher education and all that stuff, and I'm really grateful for the sacrifice that my immigrant family has done to get me to this place. So one way that I try to be an ally within my communities is, in BIPOC communities, is really educate other people, educate healers, you know, in consent, in gender equity. I think there's this, unfortunately, what I've seen is that there's this separation of like, who is certified to teach what. And I'm kind of like, let's be done with that, you know, because I think there's a lot of people who are not certified that are really, really educated. And if they're given the knowledge and the tools to best serve the clients and the people that they're trying to serve, I think that we need more of that. So that's part of what I've been trying to do, is really train and educate healers within communities. And this is like brujans, this is midwives, this is herbalists. There's been a call for, like Farah was saying, to decolonize health and healthcare. And we're trying to tap back into this indigenous knowledge and decolonize and learn what the ancestors left behind. There's a disconnect. So I think understanding and finding the right people that have been doing that work, for example, remedies for terminating a pregnancy. People are so eager for it, but they jump into it and they don't know the risks that are involved with that, right? So that's just one specific example that I thought of right now. And just being able to be in a community and teach people and go back to mentorship. You know, mentorship is so, I think it's been so lost, and it's been such a monetized thing now. When in communities, mentorship just kind of comes naturally. So that's really what I've been trying to do in my work, and I encourage other people to do as well.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. We're going to answer a couple audience questions. So Carlo, are there any questions from the audience that we've gotten so far? I'll let you kind of ask some of those.
Hi, Joy. Yes, there are. This is Carlo from Now National. The first question comes from Christina Hildebrand. Do you feel that doctors jump to hysterectomy and other drastic measures faster in the Black community as a quick solution and make the assumption there is a level of health literacy versus providing the proper education and options?
Is anyone gonna? Go ahead, Chiquita. You take that one. Yes, it's documented. We're the highest number globally for hysterectomy. So yes, I can speak from my personal experience. I had fibroids. They grew over COVID. I needed to have a surgery, couldn't because COVID, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, you could only have like emergency surgery. So that put me out for a year. By the time I got there, the fibroids had grown. They were really big. And so the radiologist you can do lots of things. Some of them are non-invasive, but the radiologist who can do one of the non-invasive procedures decided I should have a hysterectomy. There's nothing wrong with my uterus. I needed the fibroids out. Her recommendation was a hysterectomy. I went back to my Black female gynecologist who assured me that we could just have a myomectomy, which is still, so that's a myomectomy is a C-section. They take out fibroids instead of a baby, but it's the same surgery. And nobody wants to have that either. But if I have to have, if my options are that or hysterectomy, I'm gonna go with just to take the fibroids out. Why? Why would this woman, the radiologist doctor, suggest that I have a hysterectomy when there's nothing wrong with my uterus? That was 2020. So this isn't like far long ago in the past. That is what is happening now. It's an easier procedure. to just remove everything. Then you don't have to come back if and when fibroids grow back. You don't have to come back if you have some endometriosis in your lining. You don't have to come back. So they don't have to deal with you anymore. So they just take it out and the problem's gone. Any problem that could ever occur is gone. And now you're pushed into menopause. So now you're on hormone replacement therapies. And now your body is out of whack. And now your thyroid is off. All these other things that can happen because they decide that you should have a hysterectomy. Why do they push us to that when it's not necessary? So the short answer to your question is yes, they push us to hysterectomies, and that is evidenced in the statistics that you can find that globally, Black women are the highest demographic for this particular surgery.
There it is.
Awesome. So I do have another question. How do we stress the importance of voting in local and state elections to dismantle Republican legislators who fail to represent the people they service, that are creating these laws that kind of hold up structural racism in education, healthcare, criminal justice, etc.?
I'll take this one. That's a really, there's no one answer for this, so I'm gonna try my best. I think it's just getting into our communities and starting with a simple question like, hey, what are your thoughts on this? You know, I think that we're so afraid, especially like when it comes to the generational gaps, like me trying to have a conversation with my grandmother about this, who like goes to church and believes certain things, it could be really difficult. So maybe not your grandmother, but maybe an elder in your community, just understanding like where they're at. And I think the older I've gotten, the more I've understood that, okay, they think a certain way because they weren't allowed to question these things, right? And just help them understand that why it's important and why it's not only about you, but it affects the entire community. Helping them understand too, or helping just community understand that these anti-abortion legislators are doing it for a reason. It's not, they use religion, they use like Christian nationalism to really promote these things, but it's not coming from a moral ground. It's really coming from a place of power and control, and it's really helping people understand that, which is really difficult. But I think starting from there, you can start to kind of unravel how this system works and why it's important for everybody to get educated on it and then become advocates.
Yeah. You know, and I agree, you know, with Cindy, we stay organized, we stay protesting, we do the old fashioned, we'll be in your face if we need to be, you know, in the face of our legislators. We hold them accountable. You know, we do what we can, although, you know, there's been so much suppression, right? And given the state, you know, of the world and healthcare and our health, you know, it's gotten a little bit, you know, more difficult and more challenging to do the grassroots level of mobilization that we used to be able to do, you know, and I know that social media is also a way to sort of stay in the face and continue to make those demands through that education, you know, that Cindy, you've been talking about. Educate folks about what's happening, you know, at the policy level. We all need to know, even at, you know, the grassroots organizational levels, as grassroots leaders, you know, we're looking at so many different things. And again, this is why the de-siloing comes into place, where as an organization that focuses on trauma and that focuses on gender-based violence, you know, these laws, they are violent. That is violence against us, right? And so really needing to hear from the reproductive health field, you know, to reach out to the anti-violence field and say, this is continuous violence against women. This is systemic violence against women. How do we work together? How do we mobilize your group and our group? How do we stay in the face of our legislators? How do we push for what it is that we want and really show up in full force is, I think that's one way. We all need to get educated. The other sort of, the other movement that is happening, y'all, is that people are extricating themselves from all of these conversations. They are exiting the conversation. There is an exodus out of that, out of these movements, because we have been failed so often. And no matter how much we protest, no matter how much we organize, they continue to fail us. And so there is a group, you will see it as the years pass, there are groups of activists and feminists and that are just saying, we're going to just take care of ourselves. We're not going to depend on, our so-called leaders. We're going to lead ourselves, and we're going to be in solidarity economy, and we're going to be in community with each other, and we're just going to take care of each other, and then just let them do what they're going to do. That will fix itself, which also has its dangers, right? But it's a serious movement that is happening, and so just really wanted to just lift that up here.
Thank you. And I do think you bring up a good point of how mentally taxing a lot of this work can be. So I did want to ask you guys is, how do you protect both activists and just Black women's health, mental health in general, when you have to deal with all these things between advocating for yourself with a doctor and the systemic sides of it? So how do you combat fatigue, whether it's within your work or just living as people of color in our society?
One thing that I do is I have boundaries with my social media. So I only do 15 minutes a day, usually, on my Eggs Over Easy, the film Eggs Over Easy film on the Instagram page. I can only do 15 minutes a day because there are so many stories, and these are all real stories. They all need to be amplified. I need to repost all of them, but I'm still a person. And so when this woman dies unnecessarily, like, I still feel that I'm an empath. So I still, I soak it all in. So I have to limit it. So 15 minutes is my max. Whatever does not get answered, it can wait until the next day, just so that I can have a buffer between my work and then my person.
It's a struggle. Let's be honest, it's a struggle. I can say I wake up every morning and I meditate. But y'all know, yeah, okay. Maybe once every 2 weeks, right? I journal. Yes, I journal. And then all of a sudden I'm like, I'm writing about this issue and blah, blah, blah. And so I think that it continues to be a struggle. I think we need to be honest about that. I think one of the most tremendous and amazing things that happened, and some of you may already know this, is that Black Women's Blueprint was able to obtain almost 300 acres of land in upstate New York, right? And we are transferring part of that land to the indigenous communities, the Haudenosaunee and the Mohawk, the keepers, the original stewards of that land in upstate New York. And we're building a space where we can recover, where our base can recover, our colleagues can recover. Consider this an invitation, to please come upstate. If you go to the visit us part of our website, this is not just me, saying, oh, go and come visit, because it's still in development. But I'll tell you this, over the summer, it was the most restful, peaceful time, connecting to land, connecting with the earth, eating the natural foods, all of the things that decrease, your anxiety, decrease blood pressure, really recalibrate your system, help you reconnect with your body, check in, drop into yourself. These are the things that, I look forward to. And, unfortunately, it's covered in snow right now, but Chiquita, I'm with you with the just staying away from social media, at least. And then just water my plants until I can get onto the land. Thank you for that question. It's so important.
Yeah, same thing. You know, I try my best to have like my non-negotiables, which is I have to have a mental health walk every day, at least for 15-30 minutes. Like nobody bother me. I want to be left alone because it takes a toll on your mental health. And you can get caught up in things that you're like, you know, I don't have the energy for that too, right? And then you're balancing family and you're balancing all this other life stuff. So I definitely have been a lot better about keeping my own boundaries. And that changes throughout the seasons in my life too.
Thank you all so much. So I did see another question in here we want to ask really quick. So Vermont has proposed amending their state constitution to include abortion rights. Do you think other states will follow suit? And what kind of impact might this have, especially on women of color?
I think going back to what our keynote was saying, that there's only 33% who believe that Roe will be overturned. I think that screams to the fact that people are uninformed. People, unfortunately, you know, white supremacy really banks on the fact that if we feel like we can't do anything about it, they win, right? The system wins, and that's really what they bank on. And so it's really difficult because understanding that is just an attack on reproductive health and rights. And not only is it going to end abortion rights, but it starts affecting sex education, right? The fact that we don't even have the same standards in all 50 states is a problem in itself, because then each person, as they get older, has different ideas about their body, how healthy relationships work, different issues that the communities may be facing, ideas about LGBTQ plus rights, you know, particularly trans rights. All of that will be impacted based on that, you know, and that's what they want, that they want to take away those rights. And I think that everybody has a right to understand how their body works, to enjoy pleasure, to seek wellness in their life. That's just a basic human right in existing on this earth.
All right, thank you all so much for all of your insight. We're going to go ahead and wrap up and move on to our next panel. But thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you once again to our panelists for their insights today. It was an honor to have you all here. I encourage you to follow these wonderful speakers on social media. We're going to be putting their handles in the chat. If you're more interested in this topic, quick plug, the Young Feminist National Committee is hosting an event about the adultification of Black women and girls, and that will be on the 28th at 7 p.m. So everyone's more than invited to attend that event, and information for that will be put in the chat as well. But thank you all so much for your time. And then I believe we're going to be moving on to our voting rights panel right after this.
Hello. So welcome back to our third and final panel of the day, Ending Barriers to Democracy, Voting Rights. So this is also another very exciting and important panel for us to be having at this time in this landscape that we're having in our society and our political landscape. The foundation of a fair and functional democracy demands a system of government by which the people elect their representatives, and where we know also that a fair and free election and vote takes place. And while the attacks on the voting rights of all individuals, but particularly BIPOC individuals, is nothing new, efforts have been ramped up dramatically since the 2016 presidential election, where we see voting rights under attack. More than 50 laws in various states were introduced to limit voting rights in 2021 alone. And these rights are not only unconstitutional, They are inhumane in some ways. And these laws have proposed a multitude of oppressive tactics to silence the public, such as unnecessary voter registration obstacles, stringent guidelines around voter identification, decreasing early voting, and limiting ballot boxes, drop boxes. And these are all calculated strategies we know, right? We know they're working together like a well-oiled machine to silence minority voices, BIPOC voices, and marginalized, disenfranchised voices of community of color, LGBT communities, persons with disabilities, women, and low-income community populations. So by prohibiting these voters like these to elect leaders who best represent them and their unique ideals, there is no one to advocate for and pass key legislation that will promote social and economic justice and equality for all. And that is truly the intention, to keep people oppressed. So in 2021, progressive activists and legislators tried to pass legislation like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, which would combat voter suppression laws. But these efforts failed due to filibuster, the typical relic of the Jim Crow era, and other measures that failed to pass in the Senate. To begin fixing the crucial issues within our country, citizens must be empowered and encouraged to exercise their fundamental right without prohibitions. So we're going to dive into all of this today and more with our expert panelists who we're excited to bring, who have been like on the front lines. And when I tell you on the front lines, I'm telling you they have been on the front lines. But we first are going to hear from an amazing keynote speaker, Bishop Leah Daughtry, a nationally recognized organizer, activist, political strategist, author, and faith leader. She worked to build coalitions and partnerships that advance the common good. She has served as a resident fellow at Harvard University's Institute of Politics and Principle on all things, on all of these themes. An organization that supports a broad array of businesses and organizations with strategic planning, project management, and community engagement activities. Bishop Daughtry is also the co-author of the NAACP Image Award-winning book for Color Girls Who Have Considered Politics. Please welcome Bishop Daughtry.
Good afternoon, my dear family, my dear sisters. I am so thrilled to be with you for this summit, which is gathering at the right time to talk about the right issues. It is no mistake that you are gathering now as we consider all that is happening across the country and that has been happening across the country concerning our voting rights. When you consider what's happened in Iowa, as its state legislature has changed the voting hours so that the polls are only open from 9 to 5. That seems like such a small and innocuous thing. But for working people, for people who have childcare issues, for people who have elder care issues, that kind of small, insidious, seemingly a throwaway thing of opening and closing the polls from 9 to 5 has a tremendous impact. People now have to choose between their families and the right to vote. People have to choose between a paycheck and the ballot box. And this ought not to be so. We know what's happened in Georgia, where they've taken a bad situation where people are standing in line for 8 hours and more, and they've made it now worse. We can't even give the folks standing in line food or water as they wait. They've changed the law so that they have the authority to just by fiat throw out election officials because they don't like the way that the election officials have determined the vote by what? Counting the votes. In Texas, you now have to drive farther if you have a car to just be able to turn in your ballot or take public transportation if such a thing is available for you to be able to cast your vote. How can we, as an American democracy, proclaim ourselves the leaders of the free world, an example to others about how democracy will work if we don't even allow our own people to have the full, fair, and free access to the ballot? These things ought not to be so. And so we ask at this moment, what is it that we can do What is our witness? What is our word? What is our action in this moment? We can resign ourselves to being Monday morning quarterbacks and to being armchair analysts and engage in a paralysis of analysis, or we can do what women have been doing from the beginning of time, and that's show up, stand up, and fight back. We don't want to go back to where this country is headed, back to a time that many of us don't even remember, before we even had the right to vote. That's where we're headed, and that's not hyperbole, that's simply the truth. So what can you do? What should we be doing now? Let's remember that the actions of the federal government, what happened on the floor of the United States Senate, was really a travesty though it was, it became necessary to even pursue that action because of what's happening on the local level. So I want to suggest that it's time for us to go hyper local. It's time for us to invest in local strategies, in local elections, in local elected officials, from the dog catcher to the mayor, from the city council to the school board, from the commissioner all the way up. It's time for us to go hyper local and ensure that people who reflect our values, our vision, are being elected at all levels, not just the Congress, not just the Senate, and not just the president, but all the way, so that we're creating a pipeline of action. Second thing, again, hyper local. What can your governor in your state do to protect your right to vote where we live? Let's take a page out of the book of Michelle Grisham in New Mexico, where she is using state law to enshrine the right to vote. We should do that in every state where we have a Democratic governor. We fix a lot of time on the Republicans, but where we have Democratic governors, are they doing everything that they can do to enshrine our access to the ballot? We need to press that point. We need to push them, pull them, threaten them, whatever we need to do in order to ensure our full participation in this democracy. And of course, we have midterms coming, and I'm going to tell you what Joe Manchin told us when we were complaining about Joe Manchin and his votes. And he said, what? On CNN, you don't like how I'm voting? Go elect more people who think like you so they outnumber me. We ought to take that advice. We need to outnumber Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and those who think like them. We need to create a Joe Manchin proof, a Manchinema proof majority, so that it doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter what those two think. We've got enough of a margin on the other side that they become irrelevant. That's our work, sisters. That's what we've got to do. Hyperlocal and veto-proof majorities. That's what we need. And I've closed now with a saying from the women in South Africa. Many years ago, as they were battling apartheid, and the men had been taken away, they were in jail and in prison, and most of the communities only had women in community to work. And then they went after the women, after Sister Winnie Mandela, after Albertina Sisulu, after Adelaide Tambo. They went after the women leaders. And the women said, they had a phrase, they had a saying that I want to share with you, and it was simply this: now you've touched the women. You've touched a rock. You've dislodged a boulder. You will be crushed. Sisters, we are the rock that has been touched. It's our families, our communities, our brothers, our sisters, our loved ones who are in danger, who are being threatened by these reactionary policies, and who are being disenfranchised by legislatures gone wild. We are the rock that has been touched. They have dislodged a boulder, and it's time for us to move into action and crush the forces that would oppress us, hold us back, and keep us from rising. God bless you. Have a great conference. Thanks for inviting me, and look forward to the rest of the conversation. Blessings.
Thank you so much, Bishop Leah Daughtry, for those wonderful, inspiring remarks, perfectly leading us into our voting rights panel. I'm so excited about this panel. It is an amazing panel of experts who are going to really talk to us about what we need to do to help dismantle the lies and damage rhetoric that we have been hearing about voter suppression and address the consequences of not voting and not convoting the voting right restrictions that we're seeing. And they're going to help us highlight some of the next steps the grassroots activists can do to kind of help help end the barriers to democracy and ensure that voting is an equal right and a fair right that everyone's going to be getting. So before we do that, I'm delighted to welcome our now's new National Political Director, Kiana Dickinson, who will be joining us to moderate this panel. Kiana comes from us as formerly Arizona's Democratic Party Political Director, where she has a history, over 20-year history of leading in political directing and collaborative efforts to engage and support voters. So I'm thrilled to pass it on to you, Kiana, to take the floor.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It is a joy and a privilege to be with you all here at Now and in a moment such as this. I am Kiana Dickinson. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our Ending Barriers to Democracy Voting Rights panel. I want to introduce to you all some of our panelists. You may have seen or bore witness to many of the work that they are doing across the country. We encourage you to visit our website for the full bios for these phenomenal experts. The links will be provided to you in the chat. We will also be taking questions at the end for our panelists, so please leave them in the chat box for us to view and comb through when we get to that point. Our first panelist is Vanessa Gonzalez, Executive Vice President of Field and Member Services at the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Human Rights, which is one of the premier organizations working to eliminate barriers to voting, particularly for communities of color. Vanessa has also served in the Obama administration as the Director of Latino Leadership and Engagement for Planned Parenthood. Welcome, Vanessa. We also welcome panelist Latasha Brown, co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund, Black Voters Matter Capacity Building Institute. She is also the founder of the regional network called the Southern Black Girls and Women Consortium, which seeks to create a new approach to philanthropy by allowing every component of the program to be created by Black girls and women in the South. Welcome, Latasha.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Finally, we welcome Ruben LeBron, Voting Rights Director for Building Back Better Together, which seeks to build coalitions to advance the Build Back Better policy agenda of the Biden-Harris administration and effectively communicates the positive impacts of these progressive policies. Welcome, Ruben.
Thank you for having me here. It's my pleasure.
Well, I want to get us right into it because this is the year 2022, and here we are still having this discussion, still talking about voting rights, still talking about barriers being put in the place of people of color who have earned many times over their rights to vote. I want to start with you, Latasha. I know you have done such tremendous work that should be commended all over the country. Your work started in the South and has moved, I would say, across the country and probably being emulated around the world, as this is not just an American problem. But how can we still be in this place in 2022? How can we still be here?
You know, I think part of the reason why we're still here is because we've not dealt with the root issue of what has created this. we're looking at this as this is just a policy difference between political parties. It's far, far beyond that. This is really around how structural racism is rooted in the very fiber of this nation. And that when we think about democracy, unfortunately, what we've done is we've actually hidden behind American exceptionalism. You know, we have operated in this way that, oh, democracy was already established in a nation that literally that only provided the franchise to white men who own land. And so this has been an ongoing struggle since the inception and the founding of this nation, you know, which women were excluded, communities of color were excluded. And when we talk about African Americans, indigenous were committed genocide on the indigenous people, and Black folks weren't even considered human beings. And so we have to really start with the root of this. Until we uproot structural racism, we will still continue to see it reach its ugly head. And what we're seeing right now, when we're talking about the big lie, Trump wasn't the first one to tell a big lie, right? With literally, there's been a foundation in this nation that has been centered around this notion that white men with wealth should be guaranteed the franchise, and everybody else around them is a privilege for them to participate at will. And so I think what we have to really recognize is what is the gifting of this moment. While that has been a challenge, and that has been the coming out of the limited vision of those who were before us, we are here now. And because we are here and America is younger, it is becoming more diverse, it is browner, we have to be able to use our power and think of ourselves beyond just thinking of ourselves as citizens of this nation. We have to start thinking of ourselves as founders of a new America. And with that being said, we have to literally create the kind of infrastructure, the support on the ground that actually builds democracy. What we're doing essentially right now is making democracy. You cannot have a sustainable, robust democracy when less than 40% of the population are consistently engaged in the electoral process. We literally have to shift the paradigm of talking to people about what it takes to restore, to advance, to expand, to evolve a democracy so that we have the nation that we desire and that we deserve.
Thank you, Latasha. Vanessa, I want to ask you this question. To Latasha's point, we are at a time and a moment such as this where we have new technology, new interest, new people, new energy that is here to address this centuries old issue. What can we bring to the table as the new leaders of this movement, and how can we push this forward and maybe slow down the work of the opposition that is trying to prevent us, and really put us in the front lines of making sure that we are always and will always have an opportunity to vote?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you for having me too. Also, I'm not happy to go after Miss Latasha. She's always so full of fire, and I'm like, whatever she wants. Great. Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. And I think when we went into COVID lockdown, a lot of organizers are like, oh God, like, what do we do now, right? And so it really pushed us to not only push our commitment to the cause, and to be creative about how we can partner and engage, but also kind of what resources were we using. I think some of the biggest things that have come out of this, and I've been doing this forever and a day, and I came up very much in respectability politics. And I think with the young generation of organizers that we have now, and folks who have come up that way, they're saying that was not the way to come up. Like, we don't want to do that anymore. I think it's making sure that really, despite the instruments, and we know social media, we have some really cool stuff to text people and really can focus in on specific communities. But I think regardless of it, it's whose voice is out there leading. And I know that it is going to be this younger generation, right? That is like, I don't give a damn about your respectability politics because that hasn't gotten us anywhere. Right. And I'm saying that from an organization that also has to typically be on the Hill. We have to be in the White House. And so we have to do a lot of these negotiations, right? And everybody has a role in the spectrum of progressivism. But what we want to make sure to do is make all of the tools available so that the young folks who are, to Latasha's point, rebuilding this infrastructure, or really just building this infrastructure and are tired of being disenfranchised, can decide how to move forward for themselves. And it's out of this respectability politics, and it's out of wait your turn kind of language, right? I think that's where we have gotten in a lot of trouble. I also take a lot of heart in that within that conversation, those voices, we have a lot of Black and brown folks who are like raising up and being like, why y'all still fighting this? This is common sense. Like, we don't let them get away with some of this stuff, and they push back. I think social media, again, is like a really good way to engage people. It is definitely dangerous as well, though. We already know that the other side is gearing up a multi-million-dollar social media campaign for dis and misinfo. And so I do think it is on the shoulders of some of us who have the responsibility to advocate and who are blessed enough to be able to do it in a wide scale, to really earnestly engage with communities now via social media, via old school, right? Like door to door, we can go door to door again. We can do drop, we can, lit drop, we can do this, right? And really start setting ourselves as, here are trusted messengers, being able to provide people the tools for relational organizing within their own families and neighborhoods, so that people can look at some stuff. And even if they're kind of feeling like this sounds right, there's something in their gut that is like, but I'm still going to double check, right? And like really providing people with the resources to push back.
Thank you for that. I think you're absolutely right. Ruben, to bring you into this and your work with the Biden-Harris administration, many activists, have a tendency to not want to trust or believe or to work with those in leadership, elected leadership, and elected leaders find themselves occasionally frustrated with the work of the activists. How can we bridge the gap between policy, activism, and electoral politics so that we can really all work together towards making sure we're guaranteed our rights to vote?
That's a fantastic question. And, to add to what Latasha and Vanessa were saying, is we have to reinvent the system. It is not working. It is absurd that in 2022, we're seeing Jim Crow relics in all these states being shoved down voters' throats and taking away their freedom to vote. So we have to create new spaces. We have to create new ideas. We have to reinvent the system. And it's going to take all of us, right? Not only do we have to make sure that we're empowering people at the ground, as the bishop says, right, going hyper local, making sure that throughout these states, we're guaranteeing the right to vote and the freedom to vote of everybody. But also we need to make sure that people that look like us, people that look like this room right here, are in positions of power to make the decisions that need to be made, right? And it's about making sure that people understand that voting rights is not just about going on election day and marking a ballot. Voting rights is about making sure that we all have a voice in, ensuring affordable housing, ensuring that women have the rights to choose, ensuring that, our parents have fair wages, our grandparents have access to affordable healthcare. So it's going to take all of us, right? At the hyperlocal level, it's going to take activists, it's going to take elected leaders, it's going to take leadership throughout the whole pipeline to make sure that we protect voters' freedom to vote from these unprecedented attacks. So that's why we're here today, to discuss how we get this done.
Thank you. And this question is open for anyone. We have seen now where we have people that are seeking to become elected officials so that they can change our opportunities, right? So they can get in there and disrupt the voting rights we have, so that they can get in there and stop elections. I live in the state of Arizona where, the fraud they spend, I don't know how many months recounting ballots over and over again. What can we do? What can the individuals here do that are listening to the sounds of your voices do to ensure that they are paying attention on that hyper local level that Bishop talked about, to make sure that our local elected officials are fighting on our behalf for voting rights?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first on that. So one of the things that we're trying to make sure folks remember is that elections are not just every 4 years, right? And that some of the most local elections that people typically don't even read about, including like local judges, are those that have the most direct impact on their lives and their livelihood. And so it's really hard to balance people who are living their lives, working multiple jobs, trying to, take care of children, you name it, with like, hey, but make sure that you read this giant pamphlet so that you know everybody who you're going to vote for, right? And so I do think, I talked a little bit about responsibility. I do think it's a responsibility of organizations who can decipher some of that, and provide more clear messaging to folks to do so. On our end, it is making sure that people understand, a lot of this stuff starts as experiments at a localized level. I mean, we can look to reproductive health fights for that. A lot of what they've done to abortion, by the time it was at the national level, it was too hard for us to push back. Like that, we'd lost a lot of that fight. And I can say that having done multiple national fights, right? But when we looked at, okay, it's the same players, it's a state level, right? It's the local level, it's health county boards. Well, nobody pays attention to, right? Those are where they're coming in. The other thing I think is that in addition to making sure the message on what is happening at the local level is paying attention to the recruitment of who is running, because we know the other side gets people really young. Opposition gets them really young, gets them, even before they go to law school, even when they're thinking about pre-law, all of these things. We don't necessarily build the bench as deep as we should on this side of the scale. And so I think with this real power and energy that we have from communities of color and communities who we always get left out, is a nice push to be able to say, okay, so now let's get now let's run for office. Like no matter what the level is, like you can run and you got a lot of people supporting you. So like, let's start moving that forward. So I think it's really just kind of a full circle conversation.
Absolutely.
I want to also add ditto to everything that Vanessa just said. And I also want to take a moment, in this moment, it is easy for us to feel a sense of hopelessness. It is easy for us to feel like, oh my God, we're fighting again. It's easy for us with all that is happening for us to feel, how can we get out of here? I really want to just raise that this is probably one of the greatest opportunities that we have in this moment to actually realign and redefine this nation going forward. That we're going to have to start seeing that we're not just fighting. We're fighting for in the short term for relief, but we have to build. And that is going to require us to radically reimagine, which is what Ruben said. That is going to require us to radically reimagine every single system. The bottom line is 51% of this nation are female. Like, how is it that is acceptable for us to ask the men to let us be a part of their system? We should already know how that's going to go. Like, at the end of the day, what we have to do is we have to be bold enough, courageous enough, and innovative enough that we're literally creating different kind of systems. We should be supporting proportional representation. We should be talking about how we're going to eliminate electoral college. We should be driving the fact that we've got to expand the Supreme Court. The bottom line is we have power. And so I'm raising that because I think there are 4 things that we're going to have to do. We're going to have to reassess where we are right now. We have to recognize that we have also been complicit in what is going on right now. Our disengagement has led us to this moment. And so we've got to literally re-engage in a different kind of way so that it's based on not just participation, but of power. And that if people are really thinking about voting as a vehicle of their agency and their power, it shifts the focus off whether it's a good candidate or a bad candidate, or whether it's a political parties. That's part of the problem. We're waiting on the best. It's almost like we're waiting on the new savior to come along and change everything. Fundamentally, the structure is problematic. And so what it's going to require is it's going to require us literally digging deeper. And so we're going to have to reassess where we are. We're going to have to reaffirm and recommit to actually how we build democracy, a democracy movement in this nation. What does that look like? And we're going to have to reassert ourselves as women, that at the end of the day, women have always been on the forefront of change. And I'm going to shout out Black women that at the end of the day, we were at the forelines of fighting for suffrage, even when our own suffrage, it did not achieve till 50 years later. And so in that, I want us to really look at this moment, not as a burden, but we should look at this moment as an opportunity for us to create the democracy that's laid out in the Constitution, because it's not been achieved yet. There are elements of it, and it's been aspirational at best. But we have a younger electorate. We have more communities of color that are getting engaged. This is the opportunity. What we have to also make sure that we have is not just money. We have to have money, mobilization, but we have to have the right message, a message that's actually speaking to people where they are and giving them a vision of something greater to look for. If we're in this perpetual cycle of just responding to those that are fighting us, that doesn't give people a lot of hope. But being able to actually put forth these big ideas, be able to put forth around this vision that we have of the America that we want to see, that can move people that are normally not engaged in this process because they're voting for their own hope and they're voting for something different. And,
I personally believe that these local election offices are even more important for voting rights than, who's in Congress and who's in the White House. And I'm going to keep digging into this hyper local message that the bishop started discussing with us, right? Think about those secretaries of state. Think about those election clerks, those supervisors of elections. They are the ones that in many states have a strong discrepancy on the voting hours that you have in election offices. They have a jurisdiction over, where and when they send vote by mail applications, how they provide language assistance, what type of poll workers we see at the polls, access for folks with disability. The amount of jurisdictions and sort of discrepancy that these folks have, secretaries of state, local election officials, clerks of courts, to impact our elections is incredible. And we need to make sure that we're using and maximizing those tools, because I can assure you that in a lot of the states that I've lived, they're not being maximized right now, right? So we need to make sure that people understand that these are the people that have power over our elections, over our voice, that we make sure that, hey, they're not the sexy candidates, right? They're not the senators, they're not the people in the White House, but they're the ones that have the most impact on our daily lives. So we need to make sure that we're getting the word out, that we're investing in those races. Today saw an article that Democrats are doing a terrible job in investing in Secretary of State offices. We saw what happened in 2020. We cannot afford that in places like Arizona, Michigan, and whatnot. So we need to make sure that we're putting our money where our mouth is, that we're getting people to know why these offices are so important, that we're getting people that look like us running for these offices, right? And I think that's how we start transforming our elections. That's how we start protecting every voter's fundamental freedom to vote out there.
I want to just make sure that we leave here and we leave our audience today with some things that they can take personally and do, because we tend to talk in settings like this and we all kind of know what the problem is and we amen each other and we preach to the choir and we all sing in the same key. But I want us to leave here today with some tangible things that each individual listening can do today, going forward in the next week and the next year, that are going to move us forward. Latasha, can you speak about something that people can do locally? Most times people feel like they're unempowered, like they're waiting on someone else, to your point, to come in and save us, that there's nothing that each individual on this call can do. What are some of the things that each individual can do today, tomorrow, and next week to make some change?
So let me just start with this and say something that Ruben said. I saw it in the chat as well, that school boards are far, far more critical in the election than some of the other pieces. We're seeing around CRT and that kind of thing, but school board impacts families. And so literally there has to be a focus, a hyper focus on taking control of the school boards. I think that is one piece that we need to think about very seriously in our communities. There are a couple of things. One, everybody needs a political home. Because I am part of this networking on now, this is a great, excellent organization that people can be a part of. And so if people are looking and they don't have a political home, it is important that you are connected to a political home. This is not the moment that people can afford to be just observers. The second thing is fun work that is happening on the ground, that it is really hard work. To Ruben's point, part of what we see is often that we see an underinvestment on local levels, where you see the money is every 4 years. It's like there's rain that comes out of the sky in certain states, right, that is connected to the federal elections. Oftentimes what you see is you don't see the funding for district attorneys and sheriff's offices and the county commissioners. So write a check, right? It is important that we're funding that work that is happening right now. The third thing is use your voice. This is a moment that we should be flooding our local newspapers with op-eds, with opinion pieces to the editors. We should be writing and lifting and having the clarion call that we need voting rights. And the fourth thing is we have a campaign called 1 Million for Voting Rights that you can go to our website, blackvotersmatterfund.org. We're asking our national partners. Our goal is between now and August and the first week in August, at the anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act, there will be 1 million people who have pledged and committed that we're going to do everything in our power to actually get voting rights legislation passed in this nation. So those are 4 things that I just want to offer for people to be able to do. And go to our website, www.blackvotersmatterfund.org.
Thank you. Vanessa, do you have any suggestions for people as they move forward over this next week? You know, Ruben and Latasha brought up great points about local elections. There's elections happening all the time. There's city elections that are not just happening in November. There are candidates that are running now. There are people that are still on the fence deciding if they're going to run. There's people still deciding in our own families, maybe in our own houses, if they're going to vote. What are some of the things that you can suggest that people do right now in their sphere of influence to help move us forward?
Yeah, I will say having the conversation is a big number one. I think oftentimes people are like, I'm not going to talk about politics. I'm not going to do, you have to start the conversation. Look, I'm not telling you to, kick your uncle out of your house, but I'm saying you need to have the conversation about what is the life that you envision and the world that you want to build and the community you want to build, right? So that's even just one baby step that you can take now. The other thing is right now, even though we're in COVID and lockdown, and there's some people who are still not comfortable going out and about, and fully respect that, we are already having candidate forums, right? And candidates are doing their online, you can join in. If you don't, you can do it in your pajamas, nobody cares, right? There's an opportunity for education building at this stage where you can listen to candidates, where you can ask questions just like we are in this forum. So find out what that looks like locally. All of you are really activated. And so this is super exciting. And so I think it's thinking about where were you in your journey and how did you start to engage? Working in politics, especially in this time frame, can be very nerve-wracking for people and can scare people. And I get it, right? I know, like, for instance, Latasha and I have been arrested together. Not everybody has to do that, right? And we're not asking everybody to do that. So if what you feel like you're comfortable doing right now is reading up on stuff, like read up on CRT so that you can tell everybody they don't know what they're talking about, right? I studied CRT in grad school. I believe in CRT. Like, this is right because you understand it. Read up on those things that you're hearing about so that you can feel more confident going into this fight. Join those candidate forums. Be engaged in something. If you hate candidates and you hate politicians, I hear you. But what I would also look about then is what is the issue that moves you? And if it's not engaging directly with a candidate, look for the issue that will move you. Most likely schools need some help, right? They always need volunteers. They always have big pieces where they need to mobilize folks. Here in DC, we have organizations who work on mobilizing homeless folks to make sure that they have food, that they have put, right? Like, just start the momentum and moving on the issue that you care about, and that will lead to some natural openings. And then, of course, sign up for all the listservs. I know it's a lot, but a lot of us are pushing out some really good information right now. We're at civilrights.org. It's pretty easy. I love that that's kind of our website. So civilrights.org. So
it's the perfect website.
I know. When I will tell y'all, when I started working here and I knew my email would be Gonzalez at Civil Rights, I was like, oh, I made it. So I think, signing up for those things that are interesting to you, take the time to do it. Podcasts are really easy too for people who like have super busy lives, back and forth. Listen to like The Daily, listen to those types of things that will just kind of inform your thinking. Look, everything has a slant, so go into it eyes wide open. But it's just getting those tidbits of information from reliable sources. I hope that helps. Just start the conversation.
Ruben, Do you have any suggestions for people that they can just do right now, today? Just leave this conference, this call, and jump right in and do some work. What can they do?
Absolutely. I have something that is very dear to my heart, and that is language access. So, for voting can be a very complicated, intimidating process for many folks, but especially for, Native citizens whose first language is not English, but also folks that just became citizens. And sometimes when they do not have language assistance, they can just choose to forego the voting process entirely. Luckily for us, we're talking today about a lot of the challenges we're seeing throughout states. For the past decade, we've seen many of the tools we have as voting rights advocates being taken away by Supreme Court cases, by anti-voter bills. But one of the strongest areas that I want to call on everybody to tap is the language assistance requirements of the Voting Rights Act. And essentially, it says that certain counties throughout the United States have to provide all election information and materials to voters in the language that they understand, right? So last year, Building Back Together launched a language justice committee to make sure that voters throughout the United States have access to election information and materials in the language that they understand. So this means translated websites, translated signage, ballots, voter registration forms, legal notices, everything. And, a lot of these places that have language requirements are in the states that determine the fate of Congress, of the White House, of a lot of the school board races and supervisor election races that we care about. So this can be really transformational if we really tap into the potential of language accessibility, and it can tip elections. So I want to make sure that everybody here goes talk to their local election offices and make sure that they're providing bilingual poll worker recruitments, that they have trained them appropriately to work with folks with disabilities, that we're making sure that we are doing everything that we can to make our polling locations more accessible for everybody, regardless if they speak Spanish, Chinese, Korean, Haitian Creole, whatever they do. But we need to make sure that people can vote effectively, independently. That is just basic decency and integrity. So let's do it. Let's fight for language accessibility, and I think it's important.
Thank you. I saw a question in the chat that I thought was excellent, and I know, and I've heard people say this many times. What can we do to encourage people that we're talking to in the community and let them know that their vote matters? What's a quick and easy way to communicate that in a soundbite, in a clip? Because our attention spans are not what they used to be, right? We are in a TikTok 10-second generation. So if you have that opportunity to talk to somebody and convince them, what would you say to them? Open to anyone.
I'll just say, when we do our work, we shift the focal point. What we say is, when people say, I don't believe in voting in the system, I was like, yeah, but do you believe in you? And at the end of the day, that you have agency, and that if any decision is made about you and your family, don't you think you should be a part of that decision-making process? We're honest with people. We balance it where we're telling them, I'm the first to tell them, I don't think that voting is going to solve all our problems. I agree with you. I don't think it's the end all, the PR, or the panacea. But what I do know is that my community needs every single tool available to it to bring resources, to be empowered, and to hold people accountable that are hurting us. And so at the end of the day, part of the focal point is shifting this notion around, we just want you to vote to participate, but being honest with people about both the limitation and the power of voting. And the second and the last thing that I'll say related to that too, is we got to give people a vision of fighting, of voting. What are they voting for? And they can't just be a candidate. They have to vote for a vision. So part of us, we've got to literally be able to articulate a vision of something that is different, that is better, that is more inclusive and more equitable, and that at the end of the day, be unapologetic about, ultimately, this ain't about politics, this is about power.
Thank you. Vanessa?
Yeah, I will just echo that. Our voting campaign is called And Still I Vote, as an act of defiance, because you will not tell us and dictate to us that you are taking this away. And so it's very much that, like Latasha said, where's the power and where's the power center? And that's within communities, right? And that's within the people themselves. And so while people are like, oh, this is a mess, depending upon who you're talking to, what we also say is that, when Biden got elected, Some people expected everything to change the next day. Nobody said voting was going to do that. You know, voting is not a magic wand. There's still a lot of things that this White House has not delivered on, right? But what we want to keep moving towards is the world we want. And how do we continue to do that? And voting is a mechanism to do that they are trying to take away and systemically destroy. But we cannot make it easier for them by not even engaging in it, right? We have to show up and we have to push and we have to fight so that they can really see the power and hear the power of the community. I think it is hard. You know, I think if anybody who's working on voting comes to you and is like, oh, just tell people it's their civic duty to get engaged. No, my duty is to feed my children, pay my rent, like take care of my family, right? So it's really important to have some empathy and understanding about where people really are, and then to help them understand like they have mechanisms in which to channel full power and to make sure that we're all moving together. I also say to some people like President Obama, like he was the dream, right? He got elected and he got up there, and that only happens when people do participate and engage.
Thank you. Ruben, do you have something quick to offer for people as a quick comeback when people believe that their vote doesn't count?
I think what both of my panelists here mentioned is exactly appropriate. And someone that I've heard do this really well is Stacey Abrams. She levels with voters about, you know, how voting is not going to save everything, right? But she does tell about the power that it has and the potential that it has and why we need to do it. And how, like Vanessa said, it'll help us, right? Pay the bills, put a roof over our head, and do all these other things. So I think we just have to be honest with folks, right? And sometimes these general platitudes about, you know, it's our civic duty, we have to do it because we have to, or other people fought for it. All of those things are important. But you have to level with folks, you have to be honest. And when you're honest with people, they'll tend to listen to you a little bit more and take your advice. So if we shift that messaging, I think we'll be able to get more folks to tune in.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists. This has been, you know, I'm back here amening and doing all of this. Thank you. Come on, I'm trying to be good on camera, but I appreciate all of you so much for your words and for your advice, because I think so importantly, we can listen to others that we believe have such beautiful voices as you all do and not feel that we are empowered in our own voice to do those things. So thank you for sharing with people, empowering them, and giving permission where permission does not need to be given, but sometimes they need it, to go out there and do the work and say the words. So thank you all, Latasha Brown, Vanessa Gonzalez, Ruben LeBron, for joining us today. You have been inspirational to all of us as we go forward. Thank you again. And I'm going to turn this back over to our president, Christian Nunez.
Thank you so much. Oh, wow. That was such a wonderful panel and a wonderful panel to close out our 2022 Racial Justice Summit. Before we go, we always, every year, we give out a Racial Justice Intersectional Feminist Award. And this year, we're giving the award to U.S. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. Unfortunately, she was unable to attend. I'm sure you all see she is everywhere, but she did send her gratitude for this award. I'm going to read a little bit about her briefly, just so you all know where her district is from, and then more information will be available on our website, because we don't want to keep anyone too far over the time. But just thanks again. And before I do that, I also want to just, I'll read a little quick about her, then we'll do our wrap up. But she has been doing some phenomenal work as a feminist activist, a racial justice activist, as an advocate, policymaker, and a survivor. In November 2018, she was elected to represent Massachusetts 7th Congressional District. And she has been making her way as the first woman of color to be elected into Congress for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And like many in her district, Congresswoman Pressley has endured numerous hardships throughout her life. And because of those experiences, she's remained a dedicated activist to her community and devoted to making informed policies that speak to intersectionality for those in her district and because of her own lived experiences. And she believes that best people closest to the pain should be closest to the power and the diversity of voices in the political process to make those best fits and policies and legislation choices. So we just recognize the true work that she has done since she has been elected and continues to do as a true, authentic, unapologetic activist and feminist, and her commitment to so many committees. And as I said, we will put more information upon why we selected her and her background and her bio, but it's a couple committees she's involved in. A House Committee on Financial Services, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Black and Girls, Congressional Caucus on Women's Issues. And so you can see why we feel she's the best the candidate for this Intersectional Feminist Award. So we want to just kind of thank her for her service, thank her for being an intersectional feminist. We continue to look forward to working with her in the future. She was a keynote at our first Racial Justice Summit and welcomed us there. So we thank her for continued support of our Racial Justice Summit as well. So on that note, I want to first give a huge thank you to all of our participants for joining us today, all of our speakers, our expert panelists, expert speakers, all of our chapters, our board members, and most and everyone who came out to support us, our members and supporters, and most importantly, our National Action Center staff who and all of our staff and supporters and vendors who helped put this event on. Without the NAC team, this event would not take place. They work hard. They are small but mighty. I have to tell you, people here at National Action Center, they think we're 50, but we're not. We're like 13. So I just want to thank my team so much for all their hard work. My Vice President, Bear Atwood, not my Vice President, now Vice President. I want to take ownership all the time. I need to stop that. But our Vice President now, Bear Atwood, and everyone who has worked hard for the work we're doing to really be committed to now 6 core issues. And we look forward to continuing moving forward to be grassroots. We realize that racial justice is not limited to just the topics we discussed here today. And we know that systematic racial discrimination weaves an insidious web into many facets of our life, but we have to start, as many of our advocates have said today, it's hyper-local. It is about value-based, how we change our values, how we rewrite it, how we take ownership, how we shift the narratives, how we redesign it, how we change our narratives, how we reimagine. We have to do this work in order to change how it looks in education, our workplaces, to change health disparities, eliminate them, eliminate police brutality. It is up to us. And this is why now we'll continue to move the needle forward through our coalition work, through de-siloing, as we've heard mostly say, and continued trainings, informed discussions, listening sessions, and member trainings. We hope that we will see you at future events. I hope that you all have shared information and picked up the handles of other panelists in the chat. We have 2 upcoming events, Economic Justice Forum, Dollar for Dollar, and our Feminist State of the Union happening in March. We can learn more about us at National Now. Those are all our hashtags, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you all. You all have a great day and have a great, wonderful week.